Greetings and welcome to the Dr. J Vlog Series. It's Friday, March 27th, 2026, and this is the second installment of a little mini-series that I'm doing on what happens when we die. Before we dive in, if you like the content and you want to support the channel, be sure to hit the like and subscribe and alert bells before you go. Thanks so much. All right, we sometimes hear the phrase that we're already dying from the day that we're born, and that's an incorrect, or at least an inadequate way of making sense out of life and death, at least in my view. We know that these bodies that we have are comprised of over 7 octillion atoms, forming at least 30 trillion cells on average. Larger people literally have more mass and therefore more atoms and cells, while smaller people are going to have fewer. And we are, as mentioned in the previous vlog, forever changing each day, each moment, in fact. We are not fixed or static entities, even though we like to think of ourselves as these concrete, cohesive beings and personalities. In reality, though, some 50 to 70 billion cells die each day. These billions of cells die off quite naturally through a process known as apoptosis. In fact, most of the cells in your body are replaced every 7 to 10 years. Some cells are replaced much more quickly than others, while some are essentially never replaced, including parts of the brain, our eye lens cells, and our tooth enamel. But in terms of cellular replacement, that's actually a good thing, right? Because our bodies are constantly renewing themselves. Cells are always working, and you can think of them as essentially wearing out over time, and thus needing to be replaced, just like your car needs an oil change, a new air filter, might need a brake job, and so on. Why? Because friction, things have worn out, things need to be replaced, at least for optimal functioning. Okay, but cellular renewal also has another implication. As cells divide, the information in our DNA gradually gets lost over time. The cells start to break down and accumulate damage, and have a harder time repairing themselves. So, for example, our cells over time experience telomere shortening. These are the protective caps at the end of our chromosomes, and this then actually sets limits in terms of our cells' capacities to continue to divide. Our cells also experience mitochondrial dysfunction, which leads to less energy production, and so many other things, all of which is to say, we are constantly, in a word, aging. That's why in our younger years, we often have so much more energy, and we can exercise so efficiently, and we can run faster and jump higher, and so much more. And our skin, our largest organ, seems to be so much clearer and healthier and more resilient. Moreover, we all start to eventually experience stem cell exhaustion. Stem cells are incredibly important. These are capable then of regenerating damaged tissue. And as we lose stem cells, we reduce the body's capacity then for self-repair. And we simultaneously experience reduced proteostasis. That is, cells lose their ability then to properly repair or clear damaged proteins, causing them to accumulate and then eventually to disrupt normal functioning. Now, of course, we all know that we're going to eventually die as biological entities. Biological death is real, to be sure. But it's very specific, and it doesn't tell us too much about what happens later. But we know a lot about biological death, and this certainly has a lot of implications. As longtime listeners already know, I myself died just about almost 5 years ago, twice actually, from a massive saddle pulmonary embolism. And I died for about 1.5 minutes to 2 minutes each time, only to be revived by my wife Farnaz, who was luckily there. Then eventually I was transported to the ER, hospitalized for several days, put on blood thinners, etc. But my point is that if my wife hadn't been there, my heart would not have been restarted, and my cells quickly would have started to run out of oxygen. No oxygen means no production of ATP to power cellular processes, and the sodium-potassium pump in my cell membranes would have shut down permanently. Calcium would have flooded into my cells, enzymes would have been released and engaged in autolysis to destroy the cell tissues of my body, and the body itself would have started to decompose long before, even before the bacteria took over. So, basically, within hours, literally trillions of microorganisms that had been helping me out in my gut, when things were healthy and I was alive, these would have started to spread throughout my body and to start to break down the complex molecules and so forth. In short, I'd have remained physically dead, and then my body would have turned into food and fuel and life-sustaining raw materials, quite frankly, for countless other life forms of the planet as a whole. Now, that's going to happen eventually. And as I said, it would have happened 5 years ago had my wife not been there. But I know eventually that is what's going to happen, okay? And it's also, by the way, why I insist on not having my body cremated. I want my physical death, if you will, to continue to feed life. I mean, it would be great if you could harvest some of my healthy organs, such as they might exist, for transplant. That would be great. But failing that, I like to think that the materials from my body and all those octillions of atoms ultimately will remain and will be repurposed, okay, for other usages across the planet. There's a lot of you and me that can be recycled into the soil and the water and the air, like the carbon that's locked in our bones that gets released, that can then feed the plants in terms of helping them to absorb, that they'll be able to absorb that through photosynthesis, and so much more. So in a nutshell, what I'm arguing is that we do not end, we simply let go of our previous pattern and disperse. We return not just metaphorically, but literally to the oceans of our planet, and even more broadly, we flow back into that largest of oceans known as the universe. Each of our deaths then ensures that so much more remains, so much more life can thrive in its many different forms. And even those atoms that don't end up contributing directly to new life will as yet be dispersed in countless other ways to increase the rich pool of possibilities from which everything else that exists can benefit. Nothing of ourselves ends up being wasted, discarded. So at the atomic level, then, we are truly part and parcel of every aspect of the ocean, of the universe, configuring here and there in different ways to form everything from the stars and the planets, to the water and the soils and the sands, to the countless forms of life with which we're familiar, and of course the many others that we don't even know about as yet. We are all in a constant state of being and becoming, of changing forms and configurations. We are always in motion, and even in physical death, we are in motion and still part of the system. In fact, if anything, we become even more deeply embedded within the system as we reconnect with so much more, at least at the atomic level. And as for myself, I actually find that deeply satisfying and gratifying. It's a thought that allows me to understand why everyone, from so many peoples across indigenous cultures, to the Buddhist thinkers, to the Sufis in Islam, to the most enlightened Christian and Jewish and Hindu thinkers, among others, why they can state with such confidence that we are all interconnected at every level, and certainly from a material standpoint, but I think it goes much deeper. So just as our bodies, the atoms, I should say, within our bodies were created billions of years ago in the stars, we know that the galaxies and the oceans and the mountains are all made up of the same elements as us and as everything else in the universe. We are part of the very same universe experiencing itself this way. And we are still, of course, as living entities, we share so much in common, not only with each other, but with non-living entities too. And that interconnectedness is reflected in all the different forms of our interactions, spanning the different configurations with which I'm familiar, the physical, the biological, up to the level of the psychological or neurological and the cultural levels as well. And so I'll address these issues of complexity on another day, but just wanted to acknowledge for the moment the broader principle of interconnectedness. And so the point is that we are constantly exchanging our atoms with our respective environments, right? And these atoms that comprise us and everything around us continually end up being recycled and exchanged over and over again. And they have been doing this then for well over 4.5 billion years since the Earth's been around. Every breath you take, no, not the Sting song, every bite you consume, every waste product you excrete, and so much more involves a transaction with our environments. And so once more, death essentially refers to the moment when your unique pattern or configuration ends, when you stop flowing as yourself as you always have, and when you can no longer engage in all those previous transactions that sustain yourself as a living person. Entropy takes over, and the organism that you were ends up merging back into the cosmic ocean. Now, I no longer ponder the question, do I wish I could live forever? It's a flawed question, in my view. I have no choice but to live forever, but rather in a different form, in a different sense. The atoms, of course, do live on, and they do persist. The energy persists, transformed into heat, chemical bonds, and motions and vibrations. We all live on forever in these senses. I know what you're thinking. But Dr. J, what about living forever as a biological person, or at least in terms of your consciousness? What happens then? What happens to one's consciousness? Heck, what is consciousness, right? These are interesting questions. What about the information that's encoded into your beingness as a person and everything that you ever did or created in your lifetime? What happens to all of that? And what about all those loved ones who have passed on and perhaps with whom we'd like to be reunited one day? Well, that's where the story, of course, gets even more interesting and complicated. But we're going to pick up that discussion in the next vlog, in part 3 of what happens when we die. But I have to forewarn you, things get, again, a little bit, less certain, a bit more speculative as we move beyond just the physics involved. But at the same time, though, I think it's incredible, it's remarkable how our understanding of physics can actually continue to help us make sense out of our time on the planet, and indeed, if we look at it in terms of our locations in space-time. And I think that that's quite useful and comforting as well. So, for example, we would typically say, and this is technically true in my case, that I lost the last surviving person in my own older person in my family genealogy, that is previous generations. That would be my mother, just over 2 years ago. And she did, in fact, die on February 26th, 2024. But from my perspective, I don't say that I can never lose her, okay, except in a very narrow technical sense, right, in terms of that biological entity that she used to be. In other words, she remains with me always in my DNA, in my memories, in her influences on my own beingness, in the photographs of her that I hang on to, that I still have, right? But most profoundly, she and I are forever together, already locked into the geospatial configurations of space-time in which we contemporaneously coexisted. All of those moments, all of those years together still exist. And I don't just mean in my memory. We're woven together in the fabric of the universe. The only difference is that entropy has intervened in the intervening years, right? So we can no longer have direct access to that state of the universe, to that set of coordinates in space-time in which we coexisted as living, breathing, sentient beings together at the same time. I cannot retrieve that state any longer, any more than I can go back to the place in space-time when she gave birth to me, but it's still there. if you follow my drift, right? When and where was that? Well, again, and by the way, does it still exist? I say that it does. And I'm going to explain why I think it does in the next vlog, okay? And again, this gets us, I'm going to try to move us beyond the purely physical, but I do want to comment further on space-time and how we do continue to exist no matter what else transpires. So there's a certain permanence that does exist or pre-exists and sustains and endures even after we leave this world as biological entities. But I also want to start to tackle these hard questions about what about consciousness and the information of ourselves? What happens to all of that stuff? All to be dealt with or considered in the next vlog. All right, for now, as ever, in the meantime, may you and yours continue to create peace in your lives, nurture love in your hearts, and dole out hugs in abundance. Keep well.